Hello, friends. This is part two of the two for one special today. Just want to thank you all once again for joining me. Hope you all continuing to do well and staying safe and healthy. I know everyone out there's being bombarded with a lot of negative news, but there's still things to be thankful for. Now more than ever, we just need to be thankful for the loved ones in our lives, for for jobs, for health, and if any one of those areas of your life has suffered, I just want you to know things can and will get better. Life will prevail, and goodness will prevail as long as we continue to persevere and continuing to show love and goodwill towards one another. And I know these times can also be really taxing on your mental health. And I encourage you to just take time each day to take care of yourself. If you're able, go out for a walk, go out in your yard, soak up some sunlight, read your favorite book, draw, call someone, maybe even talk to in a while. Share some laughs, try a new recipe, whatever it may be. That's the whole reason I started this channel. I just want you all to be able to listen to just something encouraging and kind of let your mind get away for a little bit in a healthy way. Um, I know there's a lot of different things that can hurt us, and not just with things going on, but maybe you have a chronic illness yourself, or you've had a loved one dealing with an illness for a while. Um, Maybe you've gone through a divorce. Maybe you've gone through a breakup. I just want to speak healing and life to you now, and that you're not alone, and we're all going to get through this together. That being said, I have a book here by Elizabeth Yates, Amos Fortune, Free Man. Um, this is the story of Amos Fortune. He was born the son of a king in the Atmunchi tribe in Africa. When Amos was only 15 years old, he was captured by slave traders and brought to Massachusetts, where he was sold at an auction. Although his freedom had been taken, Amos never lost his dignity and courage. He dreamed of being free and of buying the freedom of his closest friends. By the time he was 60 years old, Amos' fortune began to see those dreams come true. You might be wondering why I'm reading this, but I am just because here's a story of a man who had his freedom completely taken away for most of his life. And a lot of you, during this quarantine, maybe feeling like you're not so free at the moment, but this is temporary and we still have our core freedoms. We're still able to, go out and get what we need. We're able to go check on loved ones. We're not enslaved. And here's a story of a person who had no choice, who had no freedom at all. And I want his story to uplift us and encourage us today to give us strength to go on. I'll start here. Africa 1725. Night came down swiftly over the equatorial forest. There was no lingering of daylight, but after the snuffing out of the sun, darkness and the bright appearing of stars. No silence came with the darkness, for this was a night alive with song and movement. In the village of the Atmunchi people were in the village of the Atmunchi people were gathering for their mystic dance that would welcome in the time of herbage, the time for the planting of corn. And to the center of the clearing, surrounded by small conical huts that was the village, a wooden drum had been brought. With solemn reverence, Sa'ala, the wise old man of the tribe, approached and began beating it. It was not long the only sound in the darkness. Soon smaller drums in distant parts of the clearing took up a beating. Then wooden flutes joined in from the outskirts of the village. The sound was muted at first, but it grew sharper and higher as the men blowing the flutes came nearer. Joined by the beaters on the drums, the sound quickened in pace and fervor as all gathered in a group around the great drum, coming into time with Sa'ala's rhythmic beating. The moon rose heavy enough for the light to filter through the heavy foliage. It gleamed on the black bodies of the men, on the faces of the women and children who had been gathering in the clearing, summoned by the music and swaying with it like a field of tall grass before the wind. When the flutes and the drums ceased, all the at the moonshee turned and faced the same way, making obeisance to their chief, who sat on a raised platform at one end of the clearing, the moon full on him and his children standing beside him. Atmun, the young prince, was tall and powerfully built, though he had seen no more than 15 summers. He carried his head high and his eyes flashed. Afmun, the 12-year-old princess, smiled shyly at her tribespeople, then turned to whisper in her father's ear. She leaned against him, hoping to hide the deformed leg that, but for her father's love, would have caused her to have been drowned as an infant. Only the sacrifice of the imperfect to the God of life could assure protection for the perfect. But the chief had gone against his tribal code and sacrificed his favorite dog to keep his infant daughter, and thus far the God of life had wreaked no vengeance on him. The Atmunchi were as pagan as all the tribes in Africa, but they were peaceable, and they were as well intense in their love of freedom. The chief acknowledged the obeisance of his people and spread his hands before them, palms down, indicating they might do their own pleasure for the next space of time. The people stood quietly while more and more of the Admunshi came in from the jungle to join the group in the clearing. At the outskirts of the village, beyond the circle of conical huts, they laid down their knives and spears. The weapons, lying in the piles without men to hold them, gave back the moonlight sheen and harmless splendor. This was a night of peace, and during it no Atmunshi would bear anything symbolic of killing. This was the time when the earth was reborn. So Allah commenced beating the great drum again, and all the smaller drums followed, but in such unison that it was like single reverberations on the night. Then flutes picked up the sound. The dancers gathered themselves together, 12 men well matched in size. Slowly they made their way around the open space in the clearing, shoulders, hips, feet, translating the sounds of flutes and drums into movement. The music quickened, steps grew longer, and guttural voices uttered the incantation which had been said by their fathers and would be said by their children. Earth our mother, sun our father, watch while we plant. Moon our sister, rain our brother, aid the seeds to bear fruit, that the harvest may be good, enough for us and our children. Over and over the words were repeated as family after family of the Atamunshi joined in until the forest beyond the clearing echoed and re-echoed the chant. Then, at a signal from the chief, the chanting ceased, and the dancers fell back, leaving an open space in their midst. Atmun bowed to his father and with a series of leaps covered the distance from the raised platform at one end of the clearing to the open space. There he stood in his full height, lifting his hands palms up to the sky. Then swiftly he knelt, palms down to the earth, bowing his head as pressing his lips to the soil. All that he had, all that he ever would be, he gave to his people. He was their prince, some day to be their chief. He could not do otherwise. Rising, he bounded back to the platform and knelt before his sister. Taking her in his arms, frail and slight of body as she was, he danced with her before the people. He is strong, they said to each other, voices hushed like the wind through the bamboo. He is beautiful, they said, smiling to each other like the first light of dawn. When the time comes, he will rule us as well, said Sa'ala, who had seen many rulers. An old woman tapped her head. Not with this will he rule, she said, but so. And she laid her hand upon her heart. See how he is with his sister. Atmun danced on, swirling his light burden above the heads of the people, then swinging her low. Always Atmun smiled, for with her brother she felt safe. Atmun's expression never changed until the dance was over. Then he set the small, dark girl down on the platform and stood before his father, head bowed. The chief laid his hand on his son's head in approval. Atmun swung around and faced his people, but a smile that flashed from his face might have dazzled the moon itself. The drums and the flutes began again to build up in air, and the people began to sway in time with it. Atmun, young, strong, tireless, leapt into their midst, leading the Atmunchi in a tribal dance until the whole clearing seethed with joyous, ecstatic motion. Dawn was still far distant, and this was the night of the year when no one would sleep. Dawn was further off than the invaders creeping silently through the jungle. 100 black men, commanded by 3 whites. Stealthily, they surrounded the village, making sure that their line was within the piles of knives and spears that Yatmoonshi had left. Dropping to their knees at a given signal, they held their guns, took aim, and waited, tense and silent, for another signal. One of the white men raised his arm, and 100 muskets blazed into the night. The dancing people stopped and looked skyward. Then they fell to their knees, bewildered, fearful only of one thing, that they had offended the spirit of the night. The chief slumped forward. All of the muskets had but one had been aimed into the tree tops. Atman rose to his feet and bounded across the clearing to kneel by his father. Then, in the strange and fearful stillness of the jungle night, he knew what had happened. He stood tall and held out his hands to his people, but no smile flashed from his lips. There was not time for the Atmunshi to acknowledge the gesture of their new chief. With cries and shouts, the slavers advanced on the village. Seeing them, the Atmunshi screamed wildly and ran across the clearing, trying to reach their chief who stood above them in strength and power, symbolizing protection. But the slavers, advancing among them, tossed the Atmunshi about like leaves in the wind. Seizing the strongest and tallest, they quickly clamped wrist and ankle shackles on them, thrusting aside the old men and women and the little children. A white man approached the platform where Atman was standing, his arms around Afman. The white man uttered a volley of words, sharp as the sound of the muskets had been in Atman's ears and less meaningful. But Atman would not lower himself to respond. The slaver advanced and tried to separate the brother and sister. Atman's hold only tightened on the girl. The white man hesitated. He had seen fire flashing from the eyes of the tall black youth, and he was afraid. A second white man, fully armed, approached from one side, and seeing him gave the slaver courage. Stepping forward, he seized Athman and hurled to the ground. When Atman reached out to help her, the 2 whites secured his wrist with bamboo withes and threw him down to chain his ankles. He's a likely one, the slaver muttered, and should fetch a good price, but he's dangerous. Tighten those irons. Dawn came. The Admunshi men and some of their women stood in a long line chained together in the clearing, surrounded by the conical huts. Those whom the slavers had not wanted cowered together, too stunned for any utterance. Commands were barked out that meant nothing to the Admunshi. Then the crack of a lash started the long line moving slowly. Seeing them disappear into the jungle, the old men and women and the little children set up a low wailing. It was so soft at first that it was scarcely audible, but it grew in volume and intensity. Desolate, deprived of their youth, their strength, their leadership, what were a handful of old people and children to do in the jungle? The line filed slowly on as the best of the Atmunshi with bowed heads and bowed shoulders stumbled into the unknown. Only a youth at the end of the line still carried his head high. Past the raised platform they went, past the huddled form of a young girl, and only the sound of her weeping let them know that she was alive. Passing her, Atman knew. Atman suddenly bent low and said something to her. Then he raised his head again. The slaver, bringing up the rear, came forward with his lash. Atman cringed as he felt it, but he uttered no sound, though for the rest of his life his back would bear the marks made on it by the white man's lash. Atman lifted her head and listened until she could no longer hear the dull thud footsteps of echoing on the jungle floor. She rose to her feet with difficulty, then holding her hands open and outspread, as was the custom of her tribe, she advanced slowly toward her people. Atman had reminded her that her birth had made her the servant of her people. He was still a prince, though chains had bound him, and she was a princess. Not a one could escape the work they had been born to do. The Middle Passage. The captives were led through the jungle from early dawn until noon, when they reached the bank of a wide river. There they were given water, but no food. Under the watchful eyes and ever-pointed muskets of their captors, they were allowed a brief rest while canoes were ready for the journey downstream. Coarse shouts and loud-voiced commands in a meaningless tongue filled the air. The Amunchi people, now so tired and hungry that their fright and bewilderment were secondary, squatted on their ground with heads between their knees. Atman looked from one to another of them, signaling with his eyes, and through the weary group a quiver of hope ran, uniting them to him. Whatever they had left behind, whatever lay ahead, their chief was with them, their traditional father. They knew that he would care for them. Atman realized that he and his people were being enslaved by power and cunning, and he must bide their time and they could effect their release in some way. Slavery was a phase of tribal war as old as African life itself, but the Admunchi had always been a free people, putting no bonds on others and resisting any put on them. Atman looked from one face to another. He was troubled in his heart about his people, for something had made them abashed and spiritless. The slavers ate well and drank freely. Then, while the sun was at its highest, pouring fierce heat upon the land, they crept under crudely constructed shelters of white palm leaves and slept. No one took any thought of the Admunchi. Under the rain of heat they waited patiently, each one knowing that a rain of fire would be his if he moved. When the sun was westering and the breeze had come up to rustle the palms and ripple the river water, the white men came out from their shelters and started giving brusque commands which the natives in their employ hastened to carry out. The captives were loaded into long canoes, 20 to a canoe, with a native in the stern to direct the course downstream. Our white men in the bow faced the captives, with musket loaded and leveled on them. Manacled and chained to each other, the Amuchi did little more than crouch in the boats, the women moaning to themselves. One of them in the rear canoe still had his head unbowed. He was determined to watch the course they were taking, so when the time came that they could assert their freedom, he would be able to lead his people back to their own village. The current was swift, and the long, narrow, heavily laden canoes moved down it easily. On both banks of the river rose a forest of huge trees, from whose tops trailed a network of vines and flowers. Below was the dense undergrowth of the jungle land. Now and again they passed small clearings where flocks of goats grazed, and tribesmen watched their goats with more interest than they did the canoes going down the river. At such places the eye could range inland from the sedgy shore of the river to distant walls of mountains. Atman, with his keen sight, saw torrents of icy water rushing down rock slopes. Then the trees thickened again. The banks of the river were clothed with giant ferns and mosses. Leaves, large as cloaks, hung down from the trees. Monkeys, chattering in their aerial homes, peered out at the side of the canoes and swung from limb to limb to travel with them for a while. Sometimes, where the river lapped the shore, a hippopotamus lay sunning his great bulk, or a crocodile slept with mouth open. The sun, though it had dropped far down the sky, still had the heat of day, and the forest blazed and quivered with its beams. Blossoms of brilliant hue were twice beautiful as they found their reflections in the water. All along the way the land cried out the year's new growth. Reds, yellows, greens were still pale with spring, but under the sun's powerful rays they would soon intensify to the fullness of summer's coloring. More and more as the afternoon wore on, they passed places where the land had been subdued. Furrows had been made in it by tribesmen preparing it for tillage, and stone encampments instead of rude huts could be seen on the hilltops. Atman saw it all. It was to him as if he had reached the world's horizon and stepped across it. So different was it to the world he had known. That one small village, hemmed around by the dense growth of the jungle. Hunger gnawed at Atman, weariness weighted his limbs, and the seam made by the lash on his back ached in the blaze of the sun. But more than all that, he felt something expanding within him, a strange feeling that rose to meet the new world his eyes were absorbing. It was as far from elation as it was from fear, yet it was a compound of each. He who had known nothing but the jungle now found wonder stirring in him that there was a world beyond. Night came, and the canoes glided down the river that was as dark as the sky above. They might have been moving through the sky, for the stars that found themselves in the water and the points of light that quivered on the rippling waves. The captives, huddling against each other in what comfort they could in their chains, slept. The white man in the bow propped his musket between his knees and leaned his head forward. The steersman shifted less often, and Atman, turning his head up to the heavens, prayed to the spirit of the night, prayed to the spirit of the river, prayed to the spirit of his father, and the voice of the land gave answer. This was the time of birth, the time of renewing. The Admunchi were peaceful people who killed the creatures of the jungle only in their need for food and had burned the entrails in expiation to the spirit of the victim. Atmun knew his strength. He knew that he could break the bamboo withes that bound his wrist. He knew that he could kill with his hands. He clenched his hands together. He was the only man awake in the canoe, but his people would waken at a word, and they would do his bidding since he was their chief. The other canoes were lost in the darkness before them. Lifting his head again to the sky, powdering with stars, he prayed to the God of life, greater than the spirit of the night, older than the spirit of the river, wiser than the spirit of his father. And again the voice of the land gave answer, sighing through the tall trees, echoing in bending fern and willowy reed. This was the time of birth, the time of renewal. This was not the time of death. Afmoon leaned his head forward on his knees and slept. 3 hours after dawn they reached the place where the river emptied into the sea. Far out on the throbbing water the Admunchi saw a ship with furled sails riding at anchor. To them it was a great bird sent for their deliverance. In his heart each one held it. The canoes were beached and the captives were driven to a line on the shore. Some of the captors waved whips, others brandished guns as they drove the Admunchi to the pits. These were a series of holes 10 feet deep in the ground, and into them the people, freed of their shackles, were herded. Coconuts were split open, tossed into pits, and the people, now almost crazed with hunger, grabbed at them. Coarse loaves followed the coconuts, and goatskins of water. The captors then laid a rough matting over each pit, rolling heavy stones to the edge to hold the matting in place. Shade from the sun was provided, but such shade offered small protection from the rain. Once a day the matting was drawn away and food was tossed into the pits, and for 3 weeks the Admunchi waited. But they did not wait alone. From time to time, as more raids were made into the interior, more captives were brought back and thrown into the pits. Some were from the tribes the Admunchi had known as friendly neighbors. Others were ones against whom they had often defended themselves. Still others were unknown. But differences or similarities mattered little in the pits, and even language made small bond. Frightened and angry, the captives milled around in their confinement. They fought for the food thrown down to them, and had neither hate nor friendship in common, only an animal instinct to survive, though for what end no one knew. Atmun tried to hold together those of his people with him in the pit, but as the days passed they seemed less and less able to respond to him, and the eyes that had once looked at him with reverence looked at him in a daze and looked away. The time came when the eyes looking into his bore no recognition in their glance. After 3 weeks the pits were full, and the White Falcon, riding an anchor, was impatient to set sail. During the days her small boats had been going back and forth to the mainland, securing foodstuffs and laying in stores, corn, beans and yams, fruit, coconuts, medicinal herbs, and vinegar in hogsheads. Once the stores were full, the master was ready to come ashore to do his business with the white traders. He would soon exchange his cargo of molasses and rum, tobacco and gunpowder for a black cargo of slaves. But only the healthiest and largest, the youngest and ablest of all those gathered in the pits would interest him. Before the trade was made, the captives were brought up from the pits and fastened together by twos at ankles and wrists. They were washed and fed well, then the hair was shaved and their bodies oiled. They stood in a long, patient row, like animals trained at last to obey commands. The traders were pleased at what the time and treatment in the pits had done, for the African tribesmen and women now were what they wanted them to be, merchandise that could be exchanged for merchandise. The traders went up and down the line surveying their property. That tan fellow there, one said, should be good for a barrel of rum, no less, or 20 pounds sterling. He'd go for more if he wouldn't hold his head up the way he does, another trader answered. What the pits didn't do for him, the ship will, the first man replied. He won't be holding his head up when he steps ashore. At where's the Falcon from, anyway? Boston, but she's going to drop her cargo all along the Atlantic coast. They're needing labor at so many places that she's making half a dozen calls. A small boat put off from the White Falcon, and soon the master arrived, together with the traders who went up and down the line inspecting the black people. Occasionally the king one he would not take, that one was removed and thrown back into a pit. No one under 4 feet could meet approval, no one over 25 years. The master of the White Falcon prided himself on being as shrewd a judge of time as he was of flesh. A score of the finest had been singled out and stood there separately, docile in their chains, heads bowed, all but one, bodies glistening from the palm oil. The master felt their muscle, ran his hands down their thighs, looked in their mouths to see their teeth. Then he turned briskly and went into the tent to do business. When the papers were signed, a signal was given. The 345 black people who, having won approval, had been bought and paid for were conveyed out to the ship and stowed away on the hold. The headroom was so low that they had to stoop to enter. The body room was so narrow that they had to lie spoon fashion, men on one side of the ship, one on the other. Wrist and ankle still chained, they'd be given no food until morning. That was part of the discipline of the ship. The mate barked at them, no food unless they behaved. And if they didn't behave, then no food, and the lash. But the waves slapping against the ship had more meaning than the words shouting through the hatch. Atmund drew himself up to a sitting position and through a small air chunk looked out. The sun was setting. Long lines of light across the water made a distant shore gleam. Mangroves fringed the tawny beaches, and cormorants skimmed over the waves. That was his land, Atmund thought. There he had been born and nursed and grown to manhood. There, for a moment of time, he stood as chieftain of his people, where the great bird in whose belly they lay would bear them they did not know. One thing he knew, that he looked upon his land for the last time. He called to his people in the Atmuchi tongue. There were 20 or more in the space near him, yet not one of them answered him. They had been made to forget, not only that they were Atmuchi, but that they were men. They made sounds to each other in the darkness of the hold, but they were only sounds. They had no meaning. All through the night, after the ship unfurled sails and caught the wind that would bear her on the course, Atmund stayed awake. He compelled himself to remember as far back as he could in the past that he might have something more than his body to carry into the future. The middle passage took 2 months of fair weather, of storms, of calm, of blistering heat, of cold that came out of the teeth of the wind. Once a day the Africans were brought up on deck for an hour. In such freedom as their shackles permitted, they were allowed to move about while their quarters were cleaned and washed with vinegar. Then the hose was turned on them, and the salt water stung their naked bodies. They were fed their meager rations and set down again, while anything but utmost docility was punished by the lash. Atmund did not try to talk with his people while they were on deck. The lash would have been his only reward. He was finding it more and more difficult to distinguish his own people, since they did not respond to him. It was increasingly hard for him even to remember the life behind him. Dulled by harsh treatment and activity, only the present seemed to matter. A little food, water to ease the mouth's dryness, and a return to the dark of the hold from the fierce glare of the sun. Atmund found that as the days and weeks went by, he could recall less and less of his early life. But there were two things that he felt he must burn forever upon his memory: the face of his sister, so he would know her when they met again, and his birthright. I am a king, Atmund whispered to himself in the Atmunchi tongue, over and over again in the darkness of the hold of the rolling ship. I am Atmund. The White Falcon made a first stop at the Carolinas, selling a third of her cargo. Her master was satisfied with the crossing. Of the 345 he had started out with, he still had more than 300. Disease had not spread among his cargo as it often did on a slave ship, and though some of the blacks had died and a few had thrown themselves overboard, a captain expected such things. Impatiently he moved off 100 men and women, those most in need of leaving the ship. Bathed, oiled, and clothed enough for decency, they made a good sight as they stood on the wharf at Charleston. Then he waited for a high tide and his fee. 15 pounds sterling he was asking for every black put ashore, though many of them would bring more when put up on the auction block, and well he knew that some of them would never reach it. The White Falcon sailed slowly up the coast. It put in at different ports and dropped off anywhere from 50 to 60 blacks at a time, depending on the need for labor and the price they could fetch. The grateful white-winged bird approached her home port of Boston on the first Sunday in July of the year 1725. The master gave orders to furl sail and ride at anchor outside the harbor until the next day. More than one slave had been forced to go elsewhere because she had tried to land her cargo on a Sunday. When the ship drew up to wharf on Monday morning, 20 slaves, all that remained of her human cargo, were brought up on deck. Among them were the strongest, those least impaired by the voyage, and those best able to stand the rugged New England climate. Atmund looked into their faces. Not one of them were of the Avmunchi. Where his people were now, he did not know. The gestures, not the words of the mate, made the Africans understand that they were to walk down the gangplank to the wharf. They moved slowly because of their chains, docilely because of the lash that could cut their naked skin as quickly as it could cut the air. A crowd of people had already gathered near the auction block, men for the most part, but a few curious women hovered on the outskirts. Atman was held by the auctioneer and his chains were removed. For the first time in more than 4 months he could walk freely, yet not freely. He had been given a pair of trousers to wear before coming off the ship, and he found them more restrictive than chains. The people on the wharf shouted with laughter at the curious way the black youth walked. Atmund mounted the block. Above him gulls were dipping and soaring, coming to rest in the tall mast of the White Falcon, filling the air with their raucous cries. Atmund kept his eyes on them. "Here's a fine specimen of the Gold Coast," the auctioneer began, slapping Atmund's shoulder and running his hands down the strong arms, the trousered legs. Well limbed, not much more than a boy, capable of years of hard work, lusty, strong, sound in health. Remember what you can get when you get them young. You can train them the way you want them to go. A voice shouted from the crowd. The auctioneer cupped his ear to hear better. Defects? Why, none at all. Can't you see for yourself? Then he consulted the paper the maid had given him describing the Falcon's merchandise. Wait a moment now. It says here that this one can't talk. Is that so? He peered at Atmund towering above them and barked up into his face. Come on now, let's hear you say something. Atmund continued to watch the gulls. The auctioneer shrugged his shoulders. That ought to put his price up. Think of having a black he can't talk back to you once he learns English. The crowd roared with laughter. A man dressed in gray and wearing a broad-brimmed hat stepped forward. He looked up at the auctioneer. What is the youth's name? He asked. The auctioneer laughed. Name? None of them have any names. The man went up to the foot of the block and looked up at Atmund. What is your name? He asked. Atmund had never heard anything come from a white man's lips but commands, curses, threats, none of which he understood. He brought his gaze from the gulls to the face of the man addressing him, for the words just spoken were different in tone. Atmund had no comprehension of their meaning, but he understood the look in the man's eyes. He had never answered a white man. He vowed to himself that he never would. But his lips opened and the word that came through was Atmund. The man in gray turned to the auctioneer. Friend, we'll take the 30 and do no bidding on this man. The auctioneer thought for a moment, realizing that he was being offered almost twice what he had hoped to get, even with bidding for the truculent black. He's yours, he said. The money was paid and the slave led down from the block. He looks an intelligent lad, the purchaser commented. The auctioneer did not answer until he had pocketed his money. That will wear away soon enough, he said. Give him plenty of hard work and you'll soon have him in the shape you want him. Atmund, the slave said again, wanting to add that he was a king, but the words had gone from him. His own name and the dwindling dust of a few memories was all that he had brought with him from his homeland. Call him Amos, the auctioneer laughed harshly. That's a good Christian name for a heathen black. He turned and gestured next to mount the block. Come, friend, the Quaker beckoned to his slave, and the gesture was understood. Atmund, the black mouth opened through no further words came. Amos now, the Quaker said, and started away. So Caleb Copeland, who had not gone to the wharf to buy a slave, but to deliver a load of woven cloth, left the wharf with a slave following him, and nothing is in his pocket from the sale of the woven cloth. That concludes this reading. I'll continue on in the story, and we'll finish this one out. After, just let me know what you'd like me to read after this, but I think we're really going to get a lot out of this story. Very powerful. Thank you so much for joining me. You all take care, and peace be with you.